Hello everyone, my name is Zenitsu and I'm back with another Digimon video. So today I'm going to be doing a tier list, except it's not any normal tier list. This is going to be my interpretation of the early game meta that we're expected to see with the BT07 set. Just because, well, BT07 is the newest set and it just got released. So I think that our BT07 format is going to be really interesting just because, well, we're playing the game already a little bit more differently than what happened in Japan. So we have cards limited and restricted that Japan didn't, which is going to have a huge impact on how certain decks are going to perform. And then on top of that, we just have different tastes than Japan does. So some of the decks that we prioritize are going to be different than what Japan prioritized. On top of the fact that our tournament structure is a little bit different than theirs. So there's just a ton of differences adding up to make this a really interesting format to be wanting to play in. But I'm going to disclose that I'm going to be doing my tier list a little bit different than your average tier list, just because I feel like listing them from tier 1 to tier X is a little bit disadvantageous, just because certain decks will have lots of different offshoots, and a lot of those tier lists don't necessarily account for a lot of those offshoots, and if they do, then half the time they're just going to end up repeating themselves. So I'm going to be changing up how I'm going to be doing my tier list to basically do 3 different levels. So I'm going to be doing the meta level, which is what you're expected to see more often than not when it comes to events. Then I'm going to have the rogue level, which is basically going to be the decks that you're still going to see every now and then, but aren't going to be in a higher prevalency as some of the more meta decks. And then the casual level, which is basically going to lump everything else in as just one big category, just because, well, there's a lot of viable decks in Digimon, and I can't necessarily justify putting everything on here, just because then this video would take forever. So just as a heads up, that's going to be my approach on how I'm going to be doing my tier lists. So with that disclaimer out of the way, on to the tier list. First up, starting off with the meta level, we are going to have the deck that everyone is assuming is going to be the best deck in the format, and that is going to be Yellow Hybrids. So Yellow Hybrids is going to be a very obnoxious and annoying deck, because the whole idea on what the deck is trying to do is basically just constantly recover and whittle away at the opponent's resources as they're just swinging into your security, and then you're just going to keep recovering and recovering your security to stay as healthy as you possibly can, while formulating a wide field of tamers and a wide board of Digimon to be able to have basically one big push turn to aggress onto the opponent after you get all set up. Granted, that setup does take some time, and there is going to be a lot of responses that the opponent can do, considering you don't necessarily have that many security threats. Like, the whole Zoe package is trying to boost your Digimon's DP in the security, which is relatively strong, but when a lot of the deck is also being taken up by tamer slots, sometimes it's not going to be as strong as you expect it to be. So it's kind of taking that place of security control, where you don't necessarily know what to expect out of the opponent's security, but you could expect that the deck is going to try to grind you out by recovering a lot, and use Susanamon as a good way to actually deal some additional damage relatively quickly with, just because once they have a field full of tamers, they're going to be starting their turn with a lot of memory, and that huge discrepancy in memory is going to allow them to make some very powerful turns with, making the deck one of the best hybrid-based decks that you could be playing with coming out of BT07. And then to try to counteract that, the next deck I'm going to be talking about is going to be Red Hybrids. So Red Hybrids does have a couple of different variants that you could be playing around with, but at the end of the day, Red Hybrids is essentially trying to do the same goal at trying to punch the opponent's security as hard as you possibly can, utilizing the hybrid package. So you have the version that's running the Ancient package, so you could try to warp into your Ancient and swing and try to fill up your trash that way, or you could just play the Emperor package, where you're just trying to double down and focus on Emperor Greymon and your mid-level hybrids to have some really good aggressive turns with your Aldemon. So it's just going to be another very strong and aggressive punch style of deck, and what's making this deck a little bit different than all of the other red decks is just the level of consistency that it has versus the others, where you can easily find a lot of its parts and pieces, just because red is one of the more expansive colors when it comes to all of the hybrids and hybrid support that it has. And then the next deck on the list is going to be blue hybrids, which is basically going to be the foil or mirror of what red hybrids is going to do. So it's another relatively aggressive style of deck, trying to take advantage of not only bouncing the opponent's Digimon back to their hand, but bouncing your inheritable sources back to your hand, so that way you could try to line up some very powerful Koji plays to use your hand in some various different ways. What makes this a little bit worse than red is the fact that Takuya is interacting with the trash, which is a little bit easier to fill up your trash than it is to fill up your hand, but that's where blue has lots of good card draw in, and blue also has lots of good levels of searching to try to fill up its hand as much as it possibly can to be able to use its cards as efficiently as it possibly can while having the availability of lots of different options to tackle various different situations. The only big downside to blue as a whole is the nerf to Ice Wall, where now you have to rely on some other defensive tools, so they might try to lean a little bit more into the Tommy package, but again, because blue is one of the more expansive colors when it comes to hybrids, there's just a ton of different packages and sub-packages and different ways to approach the deck, making it a very strong and very fun deck to be using. And then the last of the big hybrid decks is going to be green hybrids. So what's making green hybrids so strong is just the popularity of the deck as a whole. It's a very cheap and a very affordable deck compared to a lot of other decks, just because it doesn't necessarily run a whole lot of high rarity cards. And on top of that, it also has two different variants with the red splash and the mono green variant, where it just can do lots of work because the red variant adds lots of aggression and search tools, and the green variant just allows you to use your cards a little bit more efficiently. So it's just a very strong hybrid-based deck just because, well, hybrids are already looking to be pretty powerful just because of the level of uninteractivity between players and tamers. So that way you could basically use your tamers as level 3 Digimon, and the fact that green also has the benefit of having a little bit more expansive of a hybrid package than some of the other colors makes it another really good choice to want to pick up and play a very strong hybrid deck. But as far as what green hybrids is doing as a whole, it's really no different than most of the other green decks, where it just wants to digivolve as efficiently as it possibly can and try to attack the opponent's Digimon to get rid of them while doing some damage at the same time in the form of piercing or trying to trash the opponent's security. And then on top of that, the fact that because we also do have a more expansive hybrid package, we also have another Ancient to play in the form of Ancient Troimon, acting as the primary defense of the deck, trying to stop some of the opponent's extra aggression. So even though, yes, the opponent can try and figure out ways to play around Ancient Troimon's ability, the fact that they have to do that and the fact that it could also turn off the multi-swing possibilities that a lot of decks have make it still a very valuable card to be playing with against certain decks. And then as far as the decks coming from the last format that are still going to be performing relatively strongly is going to be Jesmon. So Jesmon is still going to be around just because Savior Huckmon has not been limited, and Jesmon gets lots of new tech and tools to be playing around with, not only helping with the deck's overall consistency, but helping with the deck's overall stay power, just because Awakened Blanc and Awakened CL are very good cards. So Awakened Blanc is probably going to be the one you're going to be seeing the most, just because Awakened Blanc is making Jesmon actually act more like Lord Nightmon, where you do have some recovery to help keep yourself in the game, on top of the fact that the new Huckmon is also helping dig out your Sistermons, so that way you could try to play your Sistermons more efficiently than you would normally before, just because we have more ways to dig them out. So Jesmon is still going to be that OTK-esque style of deck, where it's just going to put and apply lots of pressure onto the opponent, and if they don't have a way to respond to their Jesmon, then you're going to be able to steamroll the game and take it into your favor very, very quickly with the level of advantage that he gives you, on top of the level of damage output that you could possibly make with him. And then another deck coming out from the last format is going to be Blue Gabubond. So Blue Gabubond, or just Gabubond, is another very strong deck that's not necessarily losing a whole lot. The biggest hit to the deck is going to be the loss of Ice Wall, so again, they're going to have to incorporate some various different defensive tools to make up for the lack of Ice Walls. But the fact that we also do have hybrids, and, well, Gabubond was already playing with hybrids, on top of being one of the more aggressive low-to-the-ground style of decks, just kind of works in this meta, just because, well, you bring your Digimon out of raising, and the opponent can't can't really do anything about that for when you go into your bond of friendship to be able to swing lots of times with and try to control and mitigate the opponent's field at the same time. Then the new hybrids, mostly the Tommy line of hybrids, also is really strong at adding some extra defensive tools into the deck, just because you could start trying to think about picking apart the opponent's inheritable sources and stunlocking their Digimon repeatedly to be able to actually act as a pseudo ice wall type of effect, making it so that the Digimon can't really do much of anything while you're just buying your time to line up a really big push turn to make the most use out of the cards that you're going to be playing with. And then we also have Bond of Bravery or Bond of Courage as another really top contender from the last format, staying around and being still relevant, where it does have lots of aggression on its lower levels, giving your level 5 and level 4 security attack +1 to try to punch the opponent's security as quickly and efficiently as you possibly can, and then you're just going to try to hold off and then digivolve into your Bond of Bravery to be able to swing and deal, again, even more damage. And the fact that there are multiple ways to build both of these decks, both incorporating hybrids and without hybrids, making the deck still a very strong and powerful deck, just because we have more different ways on how to approach the style of deck. And then the last big meta deck that's going to be hanging around in terms of what we're expected to see a lot of is going to be the Lilith Loop deck. So Lilith Loop is still just that good of a deck where the value that you're going to be getting off of your Omnimon Swart is still going to be relatively powerful, just because the opponent might not have ways of dealing with multiple level 6s and 5s just spawning out of nowhere, and you could still make very powerful combo lines of play happen, even though, yes, Mega Digimon Fusion did get hit, but we have win rate 60% to act as a really good substitute to be able to make our lines of play just as efficiently as they were before. Well, it's not just as efficient, it's a little bit less efficient, but it's making the deck a little bit more fair, and the fact that we do have the Icemon package to help accelerate the deck makes it still a very powerful deck to be playing with, just because spawning a wide field and asking your opponent to break that wide field is still a very powerful strategy. Next, moving on to the rogue level, we have Lord Nightmon. So Lord Nightmon is still going to be a really strong deck to be using because, well, the ability to play Nightmons for free, try to control the field while being able to get up into another level 6 is still just really good. Now that we also have the Kazuchimon line to incorporate inside of Lord Nightmon, we even have more different things that our Lord Nightmon can do. So we could try to make a Boutsmon, Bulkmon, Lord Knight blocker. We could try to use a Kazuchimon to help deal some additional damage. We have cards like Electric Rush to be able to let Lord Nightmon multi-swing to play multiple bodies for free. So there's just more different things that the deck can do, adding to its overall toolbox to still make it a really relevant deck, depending on the direction that you want to take it. And speaking of different directions and really powerful deck, we also have the Titamon deck that's still going to be hanging around just because the Icemon package and the Nidhogg package is just a really good complement to what the deck is trying to do. Granted, the Icemon package is going to be eating up a lot of the level 4s, so you're going to have a little bit of a harder time in terms of running the Ginkaku Kinkaku package, but I think just because the Icemon package adds to the overall consistency of the deck, it still adds lots of viability and different ways that you could actually approach Titamon. And then the fact that we do have more cards that interact with discarding just, again, add to his overall toolbox to be able to use it in some various different ways, and we even have some lots of other cards to try to increase the amount of synergy and power plays that we have, so we could even incorporate some cards like Demonic Disaster to try to delete our Icemon Scatter Mode to be able to use that ability while restanding our Titamon to be able to multi-swing with Security Attack Plus, being able to punch the opponent relatively hard at some slightly higher DP makes him a very viable deck still. And then next we have the D-Brigade deck. So D-Brigades, like Green Hybrids, is a really cheap and efficient deck to be playing around with, making it one of the better aggro decks to use. And it got even more tech and tools that it could be incorporating in the form of the Skull Knight package, so that way you could try to get recursive value off of your Skull Knights. And then on top of that, it has just a whole bunch of other sub-variants that you could still run that are all still performing relatively well, making it just a very interesting deck to build around and a very easy strategy to use. Next, we have the X Antibody deck. So unfortunately, the thing that's kind of holding X Antibodies back is the fact that the package isn't necessarily complete. So we know that in the future, the X Antibody deck is going to be getting more cards to support it, but as of right now, it just started and it doesn't necessarily have all of the support that it needs to do well. But this is basically going to take place of the black toolbox style of deck, where you could really tech the deck to do lots of different things, depending on what you're trying to gain out of the deck. My favorite thing to do with the deck is try to line up Zubagon Punch, just because it has a really easy way for us to use Zubagon Punch, and spawning a big reboot blocker that doesn't necessarily die super easily is going to be really valuable for the meta when the opponent is going to be able to hit you for lots of damage off of their one big mega. So having counter lines at play to not only try to kill their Digimon, but to use your Digimon to its utmost potential, as far as what we have right now, is making the X Antibody deck just a really fun deck to be playing around with. And then speaking of fun decks to be playing around with that still can do relatively well, we have the purple hybrids or various Cherubimon based builds. So Cherubimon is another very flexible and versatile Digimon to be building around, so you could build him in a more aggro rush style of deck, using various different colors low-level Digimon, on top of the fact that he naturally just wants to support Tamers, and, well, when you're wanting to support Tamers, that just naturally wants to support hybrids. So you could also build a hybrid-based Cherubimon deck, so again, he just has lots of different ways that you could build him, depending on what you actually are trying to do and want to focus on, but the fact that he has a really easy-to-use package and can be used in various different ways makes him a really strong deck to be thinking about. And speaking of really strong decks to think about, we also have Security Control. So I do think a lot of the Security Control players are going to be shifting over towards yellow hybrids, just because hybrids as a whole kind of dance and dodge around Security Control, where they can't, well, efficiently control the field because there's not really much of a field for them to control. But that's not saying Security Control can't adapt to the meta and still be a very dangerous deck to be playing around with, just because for a lot of decks they still want to rely on that level 6, and Security Control has very easy ways of trying to not only recover and keep yourself alive, but be able to deal with mid to high level Digimon, which certain decks don't necessarily have the ability to. And then, not to mention, just the fact that Security Control is a completely different beast of a deck than most of the other decks will always keep it meta-relevant and viable, just because you could tech lots of different things to try to handle any given meta, as long as you're skilled enough to figure out ways to adapt the deck in the current environment. Next, we have the Hexablaumon deck. So the Hexablaumon deck is still going to be a pretty good deck, just because, well, the Tommy line is kind of doing exactly what Hexablaumon wants to do, which is attack the opponent's inheritable sources and gain benefits for doing so, and keep their Digimon from doing anything, which is all stuff Hexablaumon loves to do. I do think that after some initial testing, it's going to shift a little bit more towards the Azulong style, where you're just going to want to passively have a Hexablaumon on the field, or utilize your Tamers and hybrids to be able to stunlock the opponent's Digimon, and then just kind of go into an Azulongmon to try to finish off the game relatively quickly and efficiently with. So it's going to be another deck that has lots of different ways that you could build it, and it's a more control-y-esque style of deck. It's still going to see some relatively solid play, just because it's another really popular Digimon to be playing around with. And speaking of popular Digimon to be playing around with, we have Three Musketeers. So Three Musketeers, for the most part, kind of drops the Three Musketeers, and they're just going to be running Bellastarmon, just because, well, Bellastarmon is that good at accruing lots of free value, and the longer the game goes, the more value you'll be able to get off of her, and the more toolboxy the deck kind of becomes. So we have lots of really powerful options that all cost 7 that we could think about playing with. So we could tech in lots of different sub-packages to make her work, or we could just double down and focus on purple and the Three Musketeers options to do, again, some very powerful things with, making her a really strong card to be using. But I do understand that depending on if sideboards actually get implemented, this deck is probably going to fall more into the casual range, just because a lot of people are going to be teching in Avenged Kidmon in their sideboard, just to try to beat out this matchup and make sure they never lose to it, just because, well, the value and recursive abilities that you're going to be wanting to incorporate into the deck. So to help shut that off, Avenged Kidmon is a really powerful card, but you could also use Avenged Kidmon in your Three Musketeers deck to, again, just try to make some very powerful plays with, just because you could reset and refill your deck, and then try to remill everything all over again to be able to reuse your Bella Starmons, or once all of your Bella Starmons are up, then put all of those options back into your deck and start thinking about using Avenged Kidmon. So it's, again, another deck that has some really solid legs, and depends on where the meta goes and how you can adapt to the deck and the type of tech and tools to make it have some lasting power. And speaking of decks that have some really solid lasting power, you also have the Machinedramon deck, just because, well, Machinedramon didn't necessarily go away, and he did get some more tech and tools to be able to flesh out what he wants to do and try to take advantage of his on-play ability to the utmost potential. So a lot of people are probably going to lean towards running a blue end, so they could use cards like Kaisernail to be able to separate him from the source, and we even have a cheap way to digivolve on top of him in the form of Chaosdramon, and Chaosdramon, even if you're just using it as a more traditional style of evolution deck, isn't necessarily a bad card, because it's still playing with the theme of trying to put your inheritable sources underneath to have a very powerful Digimon with. And the fact that we have easier ways to be able to play him make him even more of a threat to be dealing with. And then lastly, onto the casual level, as I stated before, this is just kind of where I lumped everything else in. So there's just a lot of very powerful and viable Digimon decks, but again, I just think that out of my tier list, these are the decks that we're going to be seeing the most of, and just because your deck didn't necessarily make this list doesn't mean it's not a good deck to be playing with, because you could always figure out different ways to adapt the deck for any given meta to be able to have it perform relatively well. Especially with the inclusion of sideboards and mulligans, if that actually is going to be a rule that's going to be implemented in the future. So that's all I really have for this video. As always, feel free to tell me your thoughts down in the comments below, and down in the description below are a couple of different ways you could support me and the channel. So I do have a TCG Player affiliate link, so when you use that link to buy cards off of TCG Player, then some of that money will go to supporting me and the channel. I also do make and sell playmats over on Overcard Gamers on Facebook, so when you buy a playmat with my design, then some of that money will also go to help supporting me and the channel. And on top of all of that, I do have a Twitch account over on twitch.tv/Zenitsu, so giving me a follow and a subscription also helps support me there, and I do play Digimon on top of various other games on that platform as well. So thank you everyone for watching, and as always, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more content, and I'll see you in the next video.